Um, so yeah, I really appreciate you having me here tonight. I'm so excited to chat to a group of people who have come together over a love of the oceans. So what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about AMCS. I'll talk a little bit about the work that I do in plastics as well. And then importantly, I'll talk a little bit about what you can all do, what we can all do every single day to try and make an impact to protect our oceans, particularly from marine plastic pollution. So I'm going to go ahead and share a screen because I do have a presentation. I know everybody loves looking at pretty pictures, so hopefully this all works. My internet's a bit slow tonight. Everybody's streaming TV at this time of the night. Can you all see that all right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Stunning. All right. So I am calling in from Mianjin, Brisbane. This is the traditional lands of the Yagara and Turrbal people. I want to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty of these lands was never ceded. So I want to talk a little bit about AMCS in case you haven't heard much about us before. We have so many different campaigns that you might be interested in. But then I'm going to talk a lot about plastic pollution. I'll talk about our plastic campaign projects, and then there'll be plenty of time for questions. So I'm keen to have a bit of a discussion at the end of it. But if someone has a question partway through, feel free to just stop me and yell out because, you know, I get sick of hearing my own voice. So, like I said, it's so nice to be here with a group of people who have come together over their love of oceans. You know, Australians just have the most incredible oceans and coastlines, but they do need our help. They're under threat from a range of different issues. So the Australian Marine Conservation Society is the voice for Australia's oceans. We're the leading national charity that's dedicated solely to protecting our precious ocean wildlife. So AMCS was actually founded 60 years ago, almost to the day. It used to be the Queensland Littoral Society, and it was a group of scientists and passionate ocean lovers that came together over threats of limestone mining on the Great Barrier Reef. And over the course of the 60 years that have followed, we've been working really hard to protect the ocean from a whole range of different threats. Now, I've put this slide in here just to show you the types of work that we do at AMCS. So we're at the moment working on the federal election campaign. We work with climate change. We look at fisheries management and sustainable seafood. We work for protecting our reef, which is the real roots of our organisation. We advocate for marine parks, for protection of places like Ningaloo and Scott Reef. We advocate for protection of sharks and rays, threatened species generally, water quality, water pollution, and advocating for stronger nature laws. So there's so much work that we do that falls under these different campaigns. But today, what I can talk about the most is the impacts of plastic on our oceans. So it sounds like you're no strangers to seeing plastic in our oceans while you're out there diving. There's a bunch of different ways that plastic can impact not just the wildlife, but the ecosystems as well. So one of the big impacts that I've been reading a bit more about today, specifically for a podcast, is about the impacts of plastic pollution on our coral reefs. So plastic pollution can deprive corals of light, food, and oxygen. And there's over 11 billion pieces of plastic entangled on coral reefs just in the Asia Pacific. Horrifyingly, coral reefs are 20 times more likely to become diseased if they're in contact with plastic. So they're finding microplastic in coral, in both their skeleton and the tissues. But the effects of coral, microplastic pollution on coral is still really under-researched, but the impacts of big pieces of plastic physically smothering them has been documented all over the world. Entanglement's a really common way that plastic pollution harms our wildlife. Almost every single species in the ocean has encountered plastic, and the vast majority of those interactions have been negative. There's issues with discarded fishing nets like this turtle here. Those fishing nets that are lost intentionally or accidentally continue to trap all kinds of wildlife indiscriminately, floating through the ocean like giant walls of death, trapping everything that they come across. The good news for that turtle is that the folk at the Dimaru Aboriginal Corporation and Indigenous Rangers up in northeast Arnhem Land found this turtle as part of their patrolling, and were able to cut it free and let it loose. So happy ending for this turtle, thank goodness. And I'm sure ingestion of plastic is something that you've probably heard a lot about. It's something that's more easily studied, and we can see the impacts of it with wildlife that have unfortunately lost their lives and have ended up washed up on our shores. Plastics can starve animals. They fill up their stomachs with plastic, leading them to think that they're full and not be able to feed properly. It can also puncture the gut. It can damage all kinds of organs. Turtles, for example, they have a 22% chance of dying if they ingest just one piece of plastic. And it's a really similar story for our seabirds, which are unfortunately very susceptible to plastic ingestion. So there's a picture here from Adrift Labs. I'm not sure if anyone's heard of Adrift Labs, but it's based on Lord Howe Island. They study seabirds. And these pieces of plastic were found in the stomach of just one dead shearwater. So our seabirds, when they feed, they usually skim across the surface of the water. And because plastics float for the most part, they end up a lot in the stomach of their adult birds, and then they're fed to the chicks. And there's some really upsetting research that's just come out about plastic ingestion in shearwaters that I'll talk about in a moment. Something that we don't talk about a lot, but is really important to consider, is the climate impacts of our addiction to plastic in Australia and globally. So each year, plastic production is continuing to increase. Soft plastics, for example, are continuing to increase at a far faster pace than population growth. And the models show that this is going to just keep increasing. Again, the vast majority of plastics are made from fossil fuels. So the extraction of those materials and the processing is contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. But not only that, but recycling also contributes to those emissions. So mechanical recycling is fairly low energy intensive, but things like advanced chemical recycling, which is used for soft plastic recycling, and even composting and energy from waste, these can all contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. There's a common myth that recycling is a great way to deal with plastic pollution. And a big part of our plastic campaign is to advocate for plastic reductions, because recycling alone is not going to help us to get out of this plastic pollution crisis that we've found ourselves in. So this is the study that I was talking about with our sable shearwater chicks. So this was just released about a month or two ago from Adrift Labs. And they looked at chicks that were less than 90 days old, and they assessed them as either high or low microplastic ingestion. And they did some sequencing of their proteins that were being expressed. So normally studies that look at the impact of plastic pollution on wildlife will look at things like growth rate, or in the case of seabirds, wingspan, and delayed reproduction and things like that. But what this study did was took birds that seemed to be healthy and had a look at their protein sequences. And they found patterns of proteins that were very similar to those in people that have Alzheimer's or Parkinson's disease. And they likened it to a small child having Alzheimer's. One of these birds that was 90 days old had 403 pieces of plastic in the stomach. And there's a particularly visceral description here of the researchers saying that when they're handling the birds and flushing out their stomachs and taking their vital signs and taking these blood samples, they could feel the plastics crunching underneath their fingers in their stomachs. So that's an absolutely huge amount of plastic to be in the stomach of such a young bird. And this is not uncommon. They're seeing this over and over again. Like I said, those adult birds are feeding this to their chicks. And for pieces that are too large, they can't actually regurgitate those up. So they just accumulate in their stomachs. So where is our plastic pollution coming from? There's a study that was released last year that showed definitively that plastic pollution is directly linked with plastic production. And there's been a couple of other studies that have looked at microplastics in sediments, and they've dated these, and they show that as production is increasing, plastic pollution is increasing. In Australia, around 145,000 tonnes of Australia's plastics enter the environment every year. That's about 250 kilograms a minute. So a lot of people in Australia have the view that our plastic pollution crisis is not our problem. It's happening on other shores and it's washing up here. That is true for some areas, but we're contributing so much plastic pollution on our own shores. And a lot of the plastic pollution in populated hotspots is actually coming from domestic use. All kinds of things are ending up as plastic pollution. Anyone who's ever done a cleanup event can attest for all kinds of things that you find. Commonly cigarette butts and soft plastics and other packaging, as well as fishing gear, but anything like, you know, zip ties and tires and textiles, these are all contributing to plastic pollution. So one of the big contributors to plastic pollution is packaging. So it makes up about 60% of litter in Australia. And that ranges from bottles to food wrappers, plastic bags, cutlery, and then plastic fragments that are broken up from those packaging. They're the most common items that have been found on the seafloor when they've done these studies. And plastic packaging is continuously at the top of the list for items that they find during cleanups. Now you'll notice that there's a couple of things in that list there that we have banned pretty consistently across the country. Plastic bags, plastic cutlery, and also things like plastic straws. These are things that haven't really been commonly circulated in Australia for at least a couple of years. But of course, all of the plastic that we produce stays in the environment forever. It doesn't ever break down, it breaks up into smaller pieces. And so those items are still out there. I did a cleanup a couple of weeks ago, just a couple of months ago, sorry, just before the cyclone. And there were some really big king tides coming in over the park, capturing all of that litter. And I found a McDonald's straw, a plastic McDonald's straw, which I have not seen in the wild for a really long time. So our projects advocate for stopping plastic pollution at the source. And here's a couple of projects that we work on to try and achieve that. So at the moment, there's a huge project happening at the global level called the Plastic Treaty, the Global Plastics Treaty. This has been negotiated over the last couple of years. It's a UN project. And this treaty aims to stop plastic pollution. It is hugely ambitious to try and get a global treaty achieved and negotiated in just a couple of years. But they understand that this crisis is so important and so time sensitive that they're trying to race these negotiations through as quickly as possible. The difficulty with that, as you can imagine, is trying to get a whole bunch of nations to agree, particularly when there's some serious oil producing nations. And as the world starts to shift away from fossil fuel energy production, plastic production is the next highest demand and is projected to overtake fossil fuel production. So oil producing nations are not happy about a global plastics treaty. They are trying to stall negotiations and have successfully done so. There was supposed to be 5 rounds of negotiation. And in August, my manager, Kip, pictured here, is heading to Geneva to undertake 5.2 negotiations. So it's at a really difficult stage, and there is just not a lack of consensus about how we manage to achieve this. The good news is that the Australian government, the Australian delegation, is in the High Ambition Coalition. So we want to make sure that we're putting the pressure on them to remain highly ambitious. And we want to include the full life cycle of plastic fishing and aquaculture gear in a global plastics treaty. So currently ghost gear, or it's usually called abandoned, lost, or otherwise discarded fishing gear, nice long name, is a huge problem. So there's a picture here of a ghost net that's been collected in Northeast Arnhem Land by the Timaru Aboriginal Corporation. And they come and clean up these beaches every single year and pull tons and tons of ghost gear, among other plastic pollution like packaging, from their beaches. So this fishing gear, like I said, it's abandoned, sometimes intentionally, sometimes accidentally. But it's incredibly difficult to trace where it's come from. And it's difficult to manage this gear, particularly for fishing boats that are out at sea for days, weeks, or months at a time. Once you've got damaged gear, you either have to find somewhere on the boat to store it or simply cut it loose and wash your hands of the responsibility. So our manager, Kip, has been working to get representatives from the Timaru Aboriginal Corporation to the Global Plastics Treaty and successfully got some representatives to the treaty negotiations in Korea last year, and is working hard to try and organise for them to have their voices heard at Geneva in August. One of the other big projects that we work on at the AMCS, and this is my baby, is an audit of Australia's supermarket plastics. So we decided to investigate supermarket plastics because supermarkets are a $135 billion industry, and I think this figure's actually increased in the last couple of months. Plastic food and beverage packaging is a significant proportion of the litter that's found in cleanups all around Australia. And I'm sure you don't have to think too hard to come across items like beverage bottles, even lids and labels from bottles, and other types of packaging like sandwiches and chip packets and chocolate wrappers. I could go on and on and on. We see these things all the time in litter, and we see them on our supermarket shelves. So we wanted to quantify plastic use in Australia's supermarkets. We wanted to assess what they were actually doing, what their actions and interventions were to try and take responsibility for this plastic pollution, and try and figure out what they can do better and identify areas that they should be working on. So in 2024, this is the second time that we've run this audit, and we rank the supermarkets based on 5 different categories. So you can see across the top there, we've got transparency, plastic reduction, reuse, recycling, and policy planning and governance. We then gave those categories weightings based on the waste hierarchy, our 3 Rs, reduce, reuse, recycle, although it's a little bit more complex than that these days, thankfully. And then we gave them an overall weighting to show customers which supermarkets are actually taking this responsibility seriously. So this year, Woolworths came out on top because they shared quite a lot of data with us, and they have some initiatives that have been reducing plastic on their shelves. Woolworths' big target is to reduce virgin plastic, which is still a fantastic effort. But like I said earlier, recycling alone isn't going to solve the plastic pollution crisis. We need an overall plastics reduction, which is what we're fighting for at the Global Plastics Treaty. And it's what we're fighting for with our own federal government here in Australia, who's promised to reform packaging legislation. And we're pushing to make sure that a plastic reduction target is included in that. As you can see, none of the supermarkets did a particularly good job here, especially around transparency. None of the supermarkets disclose their overall plastic packaging footprint. So none of them tell us how much plastic packaging they're putting on the market every single year. They're also not sharing a lot about which plastics they're reducing. You'll see that they're cherry picking things like Coles saying that they've got rid of their plastic bread tags. Incredible. I think it's removed like 3,000 tons of plastic every single year, which is incredible. But there's still so much plastic on their shelves, and we don't know whether they're adding new plastic packaging to offset any of the reductions that they're making. So this year we got a lot of media about our supermarkets project. And one of the big reasons for this is because a lot of shoppers all around Australia collected data for us in the supermarkets and found that in more than 70% of cases, it's actually more expensive for you to buy the loose fresh produce than it is to buy the pre-packaged produce. So per kilo, you can see potatoes here, 42% more expensive to buy individually, buy loose, rather than grabbing the plastic bag of potatoes. Similar case for onions, oranges, carrots, and apples. These were just the top few items. Interestingly, the only produce that was actually cheaper to buy loose was tomatoes. The lines that we get from the supermarkets on why this is are really varied. Coles tells us that they want to give customers choice and that they package up the smaller fruit and put them into bags. And Woolworths claims that it increases shelf life of products. Now, this is a study from an organisation called WRAP in the UK. They're a food waste charity. Their main remit is to reduce food waste. And we have a bunch of these charities that are working in Australia to do a very similar thing. Now, they did a study about plastic packaging and fresh produce and found that there was no real difference between packaged produce and loose produce on the shelf life. And in fact, they advocate for supermarkets to sell all fresh produce loose unless they can prove that their packaging not just increases shelf life, but reduces food waste. Now, when we asked all of the major supermarkets in Australia to provide us with that information, none of us could point us in the direction of any research that they've personally conducted. And only one of them, Metcash, who owns brands like IGA, pointed us to a couple of peer-reviewed studies that talk generally about packaging and shelf life. So WRAP UK estimates that 6,500 waste trucks worth of food per year could be saved if produce is sold loose, so that customers can buy the right amount. So that was a huge finding from our audit last year. At the moment, there's shoppers all around Australia who are collecting data for us again, so that we can compare and see how the supermarkets are tracking. We've been talking to them constantly over the last couple of years, trying to advocate for some changes to their packaging and their practices. So I'm really excited to see what the results are in 2025 and see whether anybody's made any significant differences. I feel like this is a pretty bleak picture about plastic pollution in Australia. But the good news is that there's plenty of things that we can do every day. Australian Marine Conservation Society is an advocacy-based organisation. So while there's incredible organisations out there conducting cleanups and getting really valuable data for us to advocate to government, we're really committed to stopping plastic pollution at the source. So we spend a lot of time developing relationships with policymakers and researchers and trying to connect the best available research to the people that need to hear it the most, that can make changes to our legislation and really stop the plastic pollution at its source. So for you lot in the room here, one of the biggest things that you can do is to take pictures of plastic pollution that you see while you're out diving or when you're on the beach or on the boat. It's really hard to convey the impact of plastic pollution because wildlife is interacting with it out in the ocean. We see a lot of it washing up on the beach. And like I said, unfortunately, we sometimes see animals that have ingested plastic or become entangled in plastic that have died and washed up on the beach. But images and videos of animals interacting with the plastic out in the environment is really hard to come by. So that's a way that you can help, is if you're out there and you see plastic and you're collecting it, if you can snap a picture and a video and share that, that's incredibly helpful. And we're always looking for more footage and more pictures, and we would be very grateful to use that in some of our communications. A couple of other things that you can do is contact your supermarkets and tell them that you want to see less plastic packaging on their shelves to reduce plastic pollution. On our website, you can take actions such as signing petitions. We've got an action at the moment around the federal election, which you can send an email to all of your representatives in your local area. And of course, coming up next month, we have a really good opportunity to vote for representatives that actually care about the environment, particularly our oceans, and are committed to strengthening environmental protection laws. I am going to stop sharing my screen now and have a look at all of your lovely faces out there and see if anyone has any questions.
Okay, Tara, first we have a question in the room from Peter.
Tara, not to downplay the seriousness of this, and I share your frustration with the amount of waste for plastic packaging in supermarkets. But I reckon in all my years of diving, I've almost never seen bits of plastic. I mean, I don't dive in Port Phillip Bay, I'm only around the Victorian coast. It's very, very rare I see plastic pollution.
Well, that's
Really?
fantastic. I'm thrilled to hear that. A lot of the plastic pollution that we do, that we see does end up on our beaches because of the currents. And, you know, we are quite lucky in Australia that we don't have a lot of these big hotspots of waste, but a lot of it does end up becoming a sink, and ending up on our ocean floor and being covered in sediment. So it's not often that it's kind of floating around in the ocean. But it does sometimes become tangled and snagged on things like corals and rocks and that. So that's really helpful to know that you don't come across a lot. And I'm wondering whether that's, you know, partly to do with the efforts of locals cleaning up their coastlines and making sure that any plastic that gets washed up on the beach doesn't end up back in the ocean once it's come ashore.
Interesting to know what other people, you guys see much of. I really see, anybody else see it?
Yeah, I clean up a lot.
Yeah.
Pretty much all.
Clean up a lot.
At the bottom.
Yeah.
But is that more around the bays?
Within the bay, I think we find it, Sarah, sorry, I'm sure you know where we live, but because we've got the bay embayment, it does wash up onto the beaches a lot more. So, I mean, we get out through the rip. That's because if it does come in, it comes up to the beaches.
Yeah.
So,
And on the piers, especially like
Yeah,
all the
fishing.
fishing
Yeah.
skis and chairs, fishing rods, just name it, is down there. But usually at the bottom, not really floating on the surface sort of thing. I recently came back from Russia, and over there, amazing diving, streams of plastics, just like rivers. And at night, we'll look at something like, oh, is this a shark? No, it's actually a plastic bottle or something like that. So like rivers of plastic in such a remote place. We did see a lot of plastic floating on the surface there.
Is there anyone online that would like to raise a hand or?
Yeah, it's Jack. I collect a lot of rubbish. I have a bag I have strapped to my thigh. It's called trash bag. It's from a bloke in Bali who's made it out of recycled goods, and I collect so much junk, rags and the blister packaging from fishing gear. There's a lot of plastic under there. Today I came up with a kid's spade, a piece of a fishing rod, some line, a lot of line. Yeah. Anyway, that's every dive I bring 3 for the sea.
Absolutely. And, you know, I think that that's something in Australia is that we do cherish our coastlines and our oceans, and we understand that we're stewards of this, you know, incredible environment. And I think if it wasn't for the effort of people who go to the ocean, go to the coastlines and pick up that plastic pollution, that we would be seeing a lot more of it. You know, I look at these litter surveys that talk about reductions in, you know, plastic on coastlines, which is incredible and promising. But I wonder what would happen if all of those people who are out walking on the beach at 5 o'clock in the morning stopped picking up the rubbish? What would happen if you lot out there that are diving weren't collecting that? What would it look like if we weren't taking responsibility for that plastic pollution that's ending up in these places that we love?
Sarah, can I ask a question? Sorry.
Please.
We've currently got a thing on the Mornings Peninsula where we've taken the rake off the beach, so the tractor and the rake. We've got a 12-month trial because we've discovered that that's breaking up the plastic further and burying it in the sand. I just want to know if that's come in across your radar up there at all.
Yeah, so there's a couple of councils that I know of that do rake beaches. And yeah, it's definitely caused a lot of concern for people burying hazards and things like that, like sharps and broken glass and that kind of thing. But yeah, they're not actually, from what I've seen, particularly effective at collecting that plastic pollution. And so it's disrupting that sand, moving it around, burying it potentially underneath the sand. So I think, yeah, interesting to pause and see what that does to the litter. And I think it would be really interesting to get people out there and actually picking up that litter themselves and doing a comparison of what the rake's doing versus what people are picking up, because a lot of that plastic pollution is really tiny microplastics. I've got a jar on my desk here. I went to the beach on the weekend with my partner and my dog, and just spent 2 minutes just looking around my, literally just a meter around me. And there were just so many little tiny pieces of plastic that wouldn't get picked up in a rake. And they do become really brittle at that point. And so any kind of mechanical movement like that, including the waves, can break it up, and it ends up being microplastics getting smaller and smaller.
Yeah, we've taken it off for 9 months. So there's been no raking, and we're collecting data at the moment. Having a huge private council. Anyone want to write some Mornington Peninsula Council for us? That would be great. Any in the room. But it's shown exactly what we thought, which is that the rake breaks up the litter and buries it more.
But the rake
Yeah,
also, it also prevents the grasses from progressing
Exactly.
down to the waterline.
Yeah, we found an endangered tumbleweed, which is now put up onto INAT. So yeah, they have to avoid that as a council because that falls under DECA. Obviously, oh sorry, what is it? 12. It was.
Yeah.
So what's the alternative, Cara? What do they do it by hand?
Yeah, we've got hand cleaners, and so it's stopping it's also stopping the tip, because actually all the wrap, the washed up seaweed and the shells and stuff was going to the tip, which was, costing quite literally thousands of dollars. So now they've just got 6 hand cleaners that do the beaches.
That's incredible. And yeah, of course, all of that seaweed and those kinds of natural debris that's going to the landfill is, releasing methane emissions as well. So yeah, it's costing money, it's increasing emissions. I'd be so interested to hear about the results of that once it's finished.
Yeah, we're still trying to fight to get the 12 months finished, but we're fighting with council now. We're about 9 months in, but yeah, I can send you some information if you'd like to have a look at it, because we'd like
I would absolutely love that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So yeah, I'll pass on the details, Cara.
That would be incredible. Thanks so much.
James, did you have a question?
No, I was just saying that I'm working with CSIRO, Tara. What we're doing is we're dissolving the soft plastics into carbon dioxide and nitrogen, and we're sequestering the CO2 into building products. So let's watch this space in 18 months.
Yeah, awesome.
So we're going to get rid of about 100, and we have a potential of getting rid of about 15 tons of plastic a year.
Yeah, fantastic.
But it's only the soft plastic though. It's only the LDPE4, which is so hard to recycle.
Exactly. I've just spent the last couple of weeks going through an application about a soft plastics collection scheme that's trying to get underway. And it's a difficult thing to communicate, the fact that we need recycling as part of a circular economy, but the amount that we're producing is insane. I think it's like over 500,000 tons of soft plastic alone every single year, and that's increasing more than population growth. So when you think about these incredible initiatives that have this amazing capacity to deal with some of these materials, but not all of them, we have to be really selective and reduce what we don't need, because I'm certainly not going to complain if I'm at the hospital and I need a piece of sterile equipment that comes out of a piece of plastic when I don't need all of that packaging that's on the supermarket shelves. So we really need to get clear about what we do and don't need and make reductions as much as we can. So yeah, James, I'm really interested in that.
So Australia currently dumps 350,000 tons of soft plastic into landfill every year. We recycle 4% of it.
Woohoo! 4%, incredible. Yep, soft plastics is a huge issue, and it ends up in litter counts all over the place. And soft plastics can also pose a much more significant risk to wildlife through ingestion and entanglement and smothering as well. So yeah, we need to reduce that, absolutely. Thanks, James.
Tara, it's Angus. Do you find different states being more pro-recycling than other states, and some requiring a bit more recalcitrant in their behaviours?
I do, absolutely. Looking at the single-use plastic bans that happens statewide, and because waste is traditionally, it's a state managed and then dealt with by local government. So a lot of states have introduced their own single-use plastic bans. Leading the way is South Australia by far. They banned plastic bags a long time ago. And they have recently, or they're about to ban the little soy sauce fish. And a lot of other jurisdictions will not touch that. They are terrified of banning little sachets and things like that. South Australia is way ahead. Their recycling rates are far higher than the rest of the country. Then you've got the likes of Queensland, my great state, where our rates of curbside recycling bins are pretty woeful. I don't have the figures off the top of my head, but I know of at least a bunch of state council, local government around the area that don't have yellow littered commingled bins, which for you lot in Victoria is probably wild. And I used to work as an environmental consultant, and the last project that I worked on, and this is only going back 3 years or so, was the education strategy to introduce yellow littered recycling bins to a local government area in Queensland with a pretty decent population. So Queensland and Northern Territory are slow behind, but it does go to show the difficulties that we face in Australia with the tyranny of distance, how we can collect and transport all of this. You know, I don't think people understand how much waste is actually transported around the country on our roads, particularly. You know, loads of recycling from Toowoomba, which is a good 2 hours drive from Brisbane, is trucked down and put into our material recovery facilities here. So those remote areas in Queensland and Northern Territory are really struggling. But yeah, recycling rates are pretty woeful.
Tara, I've got a question from online.
Yeah.
I'll put my glasses on so I can read it. Okay, are there, from the perspective of your organisation, are there examples of changing in the way stormwater is managed to prevent plastic entering waterways and oceans in the first place?
Yeah, so that's an interesting one. Stormwater management is like a really simple solution to deal with some of those macroplastics that are ending up in our waterways. It's pretty astounding. You go to any school and talk to any primary school age child, and they'll tell you without any hesitation that everything that washes down the gutter ends up in our oceans. But for some reason, the vast majority of our adult population just doesn't seem to make that connection. And so when you look at the litter traps that collect rubbish in stormwater drains in councils that do that, it collects huge amounts of plastic. So I think that's a really great strategy, particularly as we're in the middle of this plastic pollution crisis. It's certainly not a solution, and we need to be reducing our plastic use overall, but it's a really interesting idea. And something else about wastewater that I've been reading about a little bit is the wastewater and material recovery facilities and other recycling facilities. So interestingly, they're actually a massive source of microplastic pollution, because the process of recycling is to collect and sort and then shred and wash the plastics. And through that process are shedding huge amounts of microplastic pollution. And the recycling facilities that we have in Australia and worldwide were built quite a while ago and don't have adequate wastewater treatment systems. So those types of litter traps are great for macroplastics, bottles and wrappers and things like that. But that process of being collected and being ground up in those litter traps can be, you know, contributing a lot to microplastic pollution. So it's a good interim solution.
Tara, can I give you some feedback? Would you
Please.
mind? So I'm a big supporter of what you do, and I was a donator, so I was giving you money every month.
Massive thanks for that.
Well, so we're talking
That's all right.
we're talking about waste, right?
Yeah.
You guys bombarded me with materials through the post, mostly asking me to increase my donation when I was donating. I wrote back to your organisation multiple times and said, please stop wasting my money by sending me promotional materials. In the end, I wrote to you and said, if you send me one more lot of promotional material, I'm going to stop my donation. And you know what? I don't donate anymore because you kept sending it to me. So, for a cause that I feel passionately about, was extremely frustrated with your organisation to the point where I stopped giving you money and went elsewhere. So that message needs to go back into your organisation, because I won't be the only one that feels this way.
Yeah, I absolutely appreciate that,
Incredibly
Ian.
frustrating. I understand you might want to do it, but when people say to you, enough, stop, you've got to have a process there to stop it. And honestly, you talk about waste. What a waste of paper. Seriously, I've just thrown it in the bin. Anyway, I'm done. Sorry. But it's
No, that's okay. It's really disappointing that there wasn't a process to be able to link that feedback back to you and exclude you from that kind of thing. And I sympathize completely. You know, we have our campaigns team, we have our operations team, we have our fundraising team. And while we're part of this big organization working towards the same goals, the fact of the matter is that unfortunately those kinds of tactics, they do tend to work. And we have these conversations a lot in our organization about what's the greater good of, you know, doing these kinds of things. And we've had discussions with our fundraising team a lot, and they've done a lot of good work in terms of phasing out plastics in their, you know, shops and their mailers. The bloke that runs our shop, he's been working really hard to look at textile recycling options. So there's definitely work being done. But I do sympathise with you, and I wish that there was a way that we could have put that feedback with you and your name and your contact and stop sending you materials that you don't want. So I can completely appreciate it. Waste is embedded in our society significantly, and we need really big systems change to deal with it. So yeah, completely understand, Ian.
done. Thank you.
No worries.
Tara, do you work with I'm coming from a Victorian perspective here, but more councils that border the waterside areas. Like in our case, we've got bayside councils that surround our bay that are probably in the best position to take action on these things. Like, do you work at the council level, or is it more just a higher level political effort?
It's more of a federal level that we work at. We work at state level as well, with things like the single-use plastic bans. And I do want to work more closely with councils, because there's definitely solutions at the council level. And like I said, waste is managed at that state level, but then councils have to deal with it all. And they often don't get a lot of say. They don't get a lot of resources about how to manage it. So it's definitely something I'm interested in, but our main kind of remit is working with federal and state governments to try and get legislation and policy in place to reduce the amount of plastic pollution that's being produced in the first place. But I'm always interested in those kinds of projects, and particularly, you know, the kind of data that's collected in those projects is really critical. Those compositional data about what's being collected can be really helpful for us to advocate to federal and state governments to introduce bans and legislations to curb the plastic pollution. So without that kind of data, it's really difficult for us to advocate for these solutions and, you know, research-based policy options.
Yeah. Are there any other questions from the floor, first of all, before we go back to online? No? Okay. Anyone online? Any more follow-up questions for Tara? Oh. Okay, Tara, well, thank you very much for your time this evening presenting to us. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and yeah, I think it's an issue that we all know a bit about, but the depth of the problem is something we really need to be opening our eyes to. And yeah, I particularly like your stats on the supermarkets and how much effort they put in. Yeah, look, going to Aldi, I know I can't buy a mushroom because there is no mushroom for sale at Aldi. It's just mushrooms prepackaged. So yeah, it's something we've got to keep an eye out for and walk away from those offerings as much as we can. So
yeah, absolutely.
So on behalf of the Victorian Sub-Aqua Group, we'd like to thank Tara Jones for presenting tonight.
Thanks so much, everybody. I've had such a great time chatting with you. I've put my email address there as well. If you have any questions or, you know, any comments or anything that you want to share, videos, images, you know, those kinds of things, please hit me up anytime. I'm all ears.